Welcome everyone, I'm George Pagoulatos, and on behalf of the Delphi Economic Forum I have the distinct pleasure of hosting this conversation with Andrew Liveris. Andrew has had a long distinguished career as chairman and CEO of Dow Chemical. He now serves in many boards. I would need another forum to list them all. In 2012, Andrew co-founded the Hellenic initiative to support economic renewal in Greece through business development and investment. He serves as chairman of its board. Thank you for all you've done for Greece, Andrew, and welcome. Our topic
Thank you, George.
Our topic today is the world economy post-Covid-19, and we are, by all indications, in the midst of the worst global recession. The IMF expects the global economy to shrink sharply by 3% in 2020. This is about 6% for the advanced economy. This might even be optimistic if one takes into account more recent forecasts, for example, by the European Central Bank. And even though strong recovery is projected for 2021, this is a global economic shock comparable to the 30s. It hits both demand and supply. It poses not just the liquidity, but the solvency challenge for a vast array of firms, as well as sovereigns. And as governments widen their deficits to stimulate their economies to contain the massive rise of unemployment, we are heading towards a huge global debt overhang, both in terms of private debt and public debt. I would like to ask for your view, Andrew. What is the prospect in terms of recovery? How fast do you see recovery happening? Is it going to be V-shaped or U-shaped? The familiar question. And whether you are optimistic about the legacies, or at least some of the legacies that this crisis might be leaving behind.
Yeah, thank you, George. It's a true honor and pleasure to be part of the forum and to have a conversation like this with someone as learned as you. And clearly the people in the audience would sit in their seats and ask that question in their business, in their various enterprises, whether they be public or private. I would tell you that all the institutions I'm associated with and all the various global activities that I do, from the Far East to the Middle East to the Americas to Australia, and of course to Greece. I mean, I would say to you that the future that we face in front of us post-COVID is probably as uncertain as it was if you were sitting in 1930 trying to project forward. And in that particular case, when you were sitting in 1930 and the effects of a massive global depression, what you didn't have is what you have today, which is, at the end of the day, COVID has been the great human equalizer. Everyone is having the same effect. We're just starting from different points. Some very wealthy countries, some very, very poor countries, but it's affecting everyone equally. What this is doing to human consumption is, in fact, a contraction that is almost unpredictable. And then, if not proactive global institutions or national institutions and their interventions, and you mentioned one of the consequences of those interventions, financial intervention of the monetary kind, to actually bridge us to a future that we don't know. And that future, if it's a V, forget the V, it'll probably be a W. If it's an U, it's a long, shallow base. If it's an L, we're in for a massive predicament: unemployment, credit crunch, human behavior having to change, maybe anarchy, and maybe from 1930 to 1939, the consequence was clear, right? We ended up in a world war. I'm not that much of a pessimist. I am not going to be sitting here and saying there's a world war out in our future, but the effects on humanity are so profound by this great equalizer that the vacuum of leadership that's in front of us has to be filled, such that the ineffective global institutions we have today and their failure, such as the insularity of the United States and its lack of willingness to lead, such as the rise of China, but China not being able to fill the leadership void, the fragmentation of the EU, the poverty of the emerging countries like the continent of Africa, the lack of any harmony in the Middle East. If you sat here and said, where's this leadership going to come from to answer your question? It has to be in the room that we're talking to and talking with. I really do believe that global institutions have to be reborn where business leaders, NGO leaders, community leaders have to begin locally, then nationally, then regionally to create the new global world order. I think what we're going to see is economic recovery is going to be 3 to 5 years. Human memory and its memory of what happened will be about that. We have about a 3 to 5 year window to fix how we treat each other on a national and global level. And frankly, that leadership has to come from people in this room. Otherwise, we're going to see profound effects that could lead to disaster scenarios.
Thank you, Andrew. You mentioned the US isolationism, and this is the big elephant in the room, at least from this side of the world. We've been seeing the US administration under Donald Trump withdrawing from almost every global institution and global agreement. And this pains us as Europeans who have been used to a strong partnership over the post-war period through which we have built these multilateral institutions that have been able to sustain growth, recovery, democracy for the last 7 decades and more. Do you see this period, these 4 years are going to be a blip in the future historians' radar screen, or is it the beginning of a longer-term trend of decoupling of the US from its transatlantic partner? And what would that imply for the strategies that Europe is bound to follow? And then what would it imply with regard to China?
Yeah, so the four major disruptions that were going on in the world pre-COVID, which I've already indicated COVID's going to accelerate. One is the new role of the United States of being inward looking, and I'll answer your question, but let me mention the other three. The second is the rise of China economically and ultimately militarily. Third is technology and digital and the arrival of connectivity of the digital kind. And the fourth is climate change and sustainability and our ability of having 7 billion people going to 9 billion people on this planet and not disrupting the planet. And COVID is a great example of the planet speaking back to us. But on those four trends, what's happening, COVID is accelerating all four in different ways. The economic nationalism that you saw in the US in the last several years that led to the election of President Trump is, in my view, having lived in the Midwest of the United States for 25 years, is because the United States model of capitalism has begun to fail, that the divide between the very rich and the people left behind has meant the evaporation of the middle class. And the middle class is used to growth such that their kids can get a better education, get to a better system, and have better jobs than the generation before them. This is the first generation where that won't occur. So the United States electorate, the half the United States that votes in President Trump, is not going to go away because those problems haven't been fixed. And in fact, what President Trump has done is speak the narrative of let's look after ourselves first. And the role that we had post-World War II and the role of, expansionists and, creating a new era, of economic well-being for the world, we really can't afford. I don't believe, even if President Trump doesn't get reelected in November, I don't believe that's going to reverse itself because that discontent is severe. These race riots that we've seen recently is just another indicator of the great economic divide of the United States and the great cultural divide. In many ways, the United States is no longer one country. The United States is splitting into at least 3 countries in terms of the way they operate and behave. So they have their hands full. America really needs to fix America. And I think you're going to see, therefore, this vacuum that it has profound effect on the EU. We're already seeing that. And, the demands of the other Western nations in this great alliance called Western democracy has to be that they have to step up. Now, you're sitting in the EU. the chances that 27 nations in the EU or some number near that can step up in unison, we don't see. I mean, the EU Parliament and the EU leadership out of Brussels to become a global leader is still a futuristic thought, not a current thought. So I do think it's going to put a lot of pressure on the countries of EU to find their way in a world that is sometimes coined G0. There's no G1 or G2 or G7 or G10 or G20. It's G0.
Well, G0 may also stand for a zero-sum world, which is what you end up with if you perceive global collaboration in zero-sum terms and you undermine global multilateral trade and other institutions. And the problem with that is that you might even end with worse than G0, which is a negative sum, where
Yes.
every side
Yes.
loses. And I think that to a certain extent, that's where we are with regard to the US and Europe. I cannot see anyone gaining from this disorder. On the other hand, we are heading towards a two-polar world, increasingly polarized between the US and China. Europe is trying to curve its niche in this world. It is realizing that if it cannot count on a partnership with the US, it has to develop its own strategic autonomy. And that is the term that has become quite pertinent in the European Union discourse. And this European Commission under President von der Leyen has defined itself as the geopolitical commission, taken over from the political commission under its predecessor. Do you see the European Union? I mean, you mentioned that it is an institution that's very difficult to find a common agreement. It's an institution that's been used on building large consensus, and consensus building takes a lot of time, and it might not even work all the time. But where do you see Europe in that environment, taking into account that it has persevered quite successfully a series of crises, successfully, at least in the terms that it has proven wrong everyone who rushed to bet that the euro would dissolve or the worst would happen. It has grown, it has shown great resilience, and it is now moving to a quite bold move of issuing a bond of 750 billion. If that works out, we'll see what happens with the European Council, which is important also in terms of placing another financial asset in the global market, which might contribute to a deeper and more liquid euro-denominated bond market. So do you see developments in that area that one could define as positive with regard to European autonomy and the role in the world?
Yeah, so, if you take the notion that a COVID-led recovery is going to come through focus in on your competitive strengths, your attributes on a local, national, and pan-national level, and you take this EU pan-national view and you say, I'm going to do some things on the monetary side that you've just mentioned, George, but now let's go and do things on the fiscal side. And let's now know that the US is not going to be there in the way it was. Know that China is going to look after China and that it's got its own commensurate risks. And the work that has to be done in the EU, in my mind, is a realization that the model that existed before, where, let's say, Germany was the great beneficiary by having exports to the rest of the EU from great German companies, or where France had its own great companies and it protected them, that you have to find your way in the EU to a local, national, pan-national economic equation that benefits every member of the EU. And so when you onshore capability, because you're worried about the risk of being offshore, that global supply chains, COVID has shown us the possibilities of interruption to those global supply chains, or when non-tariff tariff barriers become reality, or even tariff barriers, the blunt instruments of the 20th century being used in the 21st century, then what you've got to do is develop a series of local and national strategies that benefit every member country. So if you can imagine sitting down around a table and saying, I've got 300 and whatever number, 50 million people in Europe, they're consumers, and I've got them spread across all these countries, and I'm going to look at onshoring capability, and I'll just make this up. Germany can be the machinery epicenter of Europe. Greece can be the IT epicenter of Europe. Italy can be the fashion center of Europe, and I'll just keep going on and on. And then every now and again, we're going to create joint ventures and alliances where we all participate in an Airbus like model. We're going to have one big airplane manufacturer, one big space operation, one big energy company that actually has multiple ownerships across all the stock markets of Europe. You've got to break the paradigm of saying, I'm a country first and a group of nations second. You've got to go to, I'm a group of nations first, if you like, a united Europe, and I'm going to spread the economic wealth such that everyone will benefit from the consumption of my nation. That mindset is a big switch. If I can get GDP to grow in Europe, not at 1%, or when COVID, obviously we're entering negative territory, but post COVID, if I can get out of this 1% stagnation that, say, Japan's been in, and get 1% more of GDP growth from doing what I just said, or even 2%, if I can grow Europe at 3%, the economic growth can then benefit all of Europe. And you can start overcoming the fiscal balances Europe has and become, if you like, self sufficient. I think that's what China's doing, and that's what the US is doing. So why shouldn't Europe do it?
Do you see, however, this being feasible in a global system of gradual deglobalization? I mean, the European Union has thrived under conditions of free trade. And then, of course, it has leveraged its own social model to temper the inequalities produced by global trade. This has been the recipe and the social contract in Europe. Um, how is the European economy able to grow in an economy that is becoming increasingly deglobalized, or maybe the speed of deglobalization is not as fast as we see it to be, but global supply chains are breaking down gradually. There's a tendency to regionalization, and there's an instinct towards protectionism, which could become quite dangerous at the global level.
Yeah, so the first, you've made some pretty important, profound statements there. And so, will we get deglobalization all the way back to nationalism? I don't think so. But I do think it's going to be a repurposing of what the free trade world looks like. And I think the second point you made is the term free trade. What we've seen with the emergence of China, the economic behemoth that is the second largest economy in the world, that will soon be the first, is they grew without really a free trade regimen. I mean, there has not been real free trade between the rest of the world and China, because we know the great big elephant in the room is China has subsidized capital, subsidized labor, and subsidized enterprises. And 80% of China's economy is with state owned enterprises. And by the way, they took the technology from the West. Now, you might have a lot of arguments about what President Trump is doing or not doing, but by calling China on that card and saying, just a second, okay, I want equal market access to your market that you get to mine. Okay, this economic benefit called build your nation on the back of the US consumer, that's got to stop. That isn't free trade. So we unfortunately have drunk that mythology, and we're thinking that that's what we're trying to fix. We're not fixing that at all. We're actually trying to get everyone to the same standard: environmental standards, labor standard, quality of goods sold that we ingest, in other words, health, nutrition, safety. This is what the standard China has to go to be a true global leader. The US, I believe, sets very high standards, and the EU, you might argue, sets even higher standards. I mean, if you like, the oldest continent in terms of the development of civilization, and you could argue Japan and China might argue with that, but Europe is a very evolved civilization. And what it's evolved to is an affordability standard it can't afford without selling goods to the rest of the world. And what I'm implying is that everyone else doesn't do free trade. Everyone else actually does subsidized trade. And what I think we need to do is look at Europe's competitive strengths across all of Europe and invest in those capabilities. There are smart people, not necessarily a lot of natural resources, there are some, but really smart, capable people to develop products for the 21st century in the digital age. Europe should have a Google, a Facebook, it should have a LinkedIn, it should have all these tech companies. There should be European versions of those. I mean, it's not just little parts of Scandinavia and some parts of the Netherlands, or Benelux. We should be developing those countries in Europe by investing in their capabilities and then exporting high quality goods to the world. I think that Europe hasn't come forward. And I think that Europe in a decelerating globalization world, that's its economic opportunity to come out of COVID.
Well, it seems that the European Union is indeed awakening to this reality of the importance of digitalization. It's putting forward its digitalization strategy, and the Green New Deal is quite a bold effort to transform its model to the requirements of a low carbon emissions world. So I guess that would be the optimistic conclusion I would like to draw from our discussion, Andrew, that this world, with all the challenges that it has presented, is also an awakening call for the European Union to be able to contribute its part towards sustaining multilateral institutions, because these are the ones that actually protect the kind of trade that you have described, truly free trade, and not trade where the deals are broken through efforts of protectionism by other parts of the world. So thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to the Delphi Forum for hosting this conversation.
Have a great conference. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Ας σε δούμε το χρόνο.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Very nice meeting you.